August 17, 1943. 25,000 feet above Schweinfurt, Germany, the oxygen mask froze against the face of pilot Heinz Knoke as he looked through the canopy of his Messerschmitt. What he saw in the sky seemed beyond human belief. German pilots like Knoke found themselves trapped in an impossible situation. From airfields across southern Germany, barely 40 fighters had scrambled. Their mission was to stop an aerial force of a scale that no one had thought possible. In the crystal blue sky, 376 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses moved in two streams, one towards Schweinfurt and the other towards Regensburg. To the men staring up at them, they looked like a vast silver glacier stretching across the heavens, their polished metal wings reflecting the sun with a blinding light. Each of these bombers carried a deadly sting, 13 heavy 50-caliber machine guns. Their combat formations overlapped perfectly, creating walls of fire that no fighter could easily break through. Knoke's unit, Jagdgeschwader 11, together with elements from JG-1 and JG-26, faced a battle that no mathematics could justify. 40 German fighters against hundreds of American aircraft. Numbers that once would have been dismissed as propaganda had now become the brutal daily reality for Luftwaffe pilots defending the Reich. What Knoke and his comrades saw that morning was not just another raid. It was the living proof of America's vast industrial power, a force so overwhelming it would eventually crush the Third Reich from the skies. Only 3 years earlier, in 1940, the Luftwaffe had dominated the skies as German armies swept across Europe. But by August 1943, the situation had turned completely. The reversal was so shocking that many German pilots later said it felt as if their world had been turned upside down before their very eyes. By mid-1943, American bombing operations had reached a size and scale that German planners had never even imagined possible. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission of August 17, 1943, officially known as Mission 84, marked a turning point in the history of strategic bombing. Colonel Curtis LeMay's 4th Bombardment Wing led 146 B-17 bombers against the Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg. At the same time, 230 bombers from the 1st Bombardment Wing aimed for the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. These targets were not chosen by chance. Ball bearings had been identified as a vital weakness in German industry. Without them, tanks, trucks, aircraft, and nearly every machine of war would grind to a halt. Meanwhile, the Regensburg factory produced nearly 1/3 of all German single-engine fighters. The plan was clear: cripple the Luftwaffe's ability to build fighters, while choking the entire German war machine through a shortage of ball bearings. German fighter commander Adolf Galland responded by launching every aircraft he could gather. Jagdgeschwader 1 took off from Dielen and Schiphol. JG-11 scrambled from Jever and Oldenburg. JG-26, the famous Schlageter wing, roared into the sky from Lille and Wevelgem. These were not ordinary units. They were the elite of the Luftwaffe, aces decorated with the Knight's Cross and oak leaves, men who had ruled the skies over France, Britain, and Russia. Yet on this day, even their skill and courage seemed powerless against the sheer weight of American numbers. Out of desperation, German pilots had begun to develop unthinkable tactics to break the bomber formations. Some, like Oberleutnant Wilhelm Neuenhofen, even tried dropping bombs from their fighters onto the formations from above, turning the sky into a deadly experiment in survival. On March 22, 1943, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Neuenhofen achieved something no pilot had ever done before. Using his radical new tactic, he dropped a bomb from his fighter onto a B-17 and destroyed it in mid-air, becoming the first pilot in aviation history to bring down an enemy aircraft with an air-dropped bomb. In his memoir, I Flew for the Führer, he later described the experimental nature of these attacks and his desperate determination to find new ways to break apart the American bomber formations. But innovations like these were little more than pinpricks against the growing tide of American air power. By October 14, 1943, a day remembered as Black Thursday, the struggle reached a new level of desperation. On that morning, 291 B-17s crossed into German skies in a second raid on Schweinfurt. The Luftwaffe responded with one of its last great defensive efforts. Over 300 fighters, scrambled from 24 different airfields. Major Heinz Beer's unit, JG-1, launched with their Focke-Wulf 190s, armed with WGR-21 rockets. JG-11 followed with the same weapons, their yellow Reich defense bands marking them apart from JG-1's red. In the skies above Schweinfurt, the German pilots struck hard. 60 American bombers were destroyed, a loss rate of more than 20%. It was a blow so severe that the United States temporarily halted its deep penetration raids into Germany. But for the Luftwaffe, the cost was devastating. Between 35 and 38 fighters were lost, along with veteran pilots who could never be replaced. Among the dead was Hauptmann Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the younger brother of General Adolf Galland. His Focke-Wulf 190 was torn apart by defensive fire, a symbol of the heavy price Germany paid even in its moments of success. These Luftwaffe pilots carried with them hundreds of hours of combat experience that Germany could never replace. Yet even the most skilled aces now faced overwhelming odds. Each B-17G Flying Fortress bristled with defensive guns, placed to cover every angle of attack. And when 18 to 21 of these aircraft flew together in a tight combat box formation, their combined firepower created a fortress in the sky. For any fighter that dared to approach, it was like flying into a storm of lead. This tactic had been perfected through blood and sacrifice. It made frontal attacks nearly suicidal, while attacks from the side were just as dangerous. The German aircraft themselves were excellent machines. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190A4 were among the finest fighters in the world. But the challenge was not in the quality of the aircraft, it was in reaching the bombers at all. By late 1943, the arrival of the American P-47 Thunderbolt with drop tanks gave the bombers something they had lacked before: deep fighter escort. Suddenly, German interceptors had to fight their way through swarms of American fighters before they could even get close to the bombers. And by March 1944, when the legendary P-51 Mustangs appeared over Berlin itself, the Luftwaffe faced a nightmare. German pilots were now struggling to survive against superior escorts long before they could even engage the bomber streams. In desperation, the Luftwaffe tried radical new tactics. One such idea was the Sturmgruppen concept, special units of heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190s armed with 30mm cannons. Their mission was brutal, close to point-blank range, unleash devastating fire, and if their ammunition ran out, they were expected to ram their targets. The Sturmgruppe attacks demanded a level of courage few could imagine. Pilots hurled their reinforced fighters directly into the bomber formations, sometimes even slicing through wings or tails with their propellers in a desperate attempt to bring the giants down. The fate of Germany's elite fighter units tells this story in miniature. Jagdgeschwader 1 Uesau became the perfect example of this decline. Named after Walter Ossel, one of Germany's most celebrated aces with 127 victories, the unit carried his legacy after he was killed in action on May 11, 1944. Ossau himself fell to American P-38 Lightnings, his death a grim symbol of what awaited even the most skilled Luftwaffe pilots. The losses were relentless. Major Hans Philipp, credited with over 200 victories, was killed on October 8, 1943. Barely 7 months later, OSR followed. JG-1 burned through commanders faster than they could be replaced, each loss cutting deeper into the unit's strength and morale. By the end, the statistics told a brutal truth. Jagdgeschwader 1 claimed more than 700 enemy aircraft during the war, but the cost was unbearable. 464 killed in action, 174 wounded, and 94 dead in accidents. The casualties exceeded the unit's entire nominal strength. Jagdgeschwader 26, Schlageter, commanded by Oberstleutnant Josef Pips Prieler, held the Channel front through the invasion of Normandy. The unit earned fearsome kill ratios in individual battles, yet the cost was catastrophic. Out of 754 pilots who served with JG-26 during the war, 584 were killed or wounded, a staggering 77% casualty rate. By the end of 1943, only 107 of its 185 assigned pilots remained fit for combat. Another unit, Jagdgeschwader 11, formed in April 1943, became specialists in attacking American bomber formations. They pioneered the use of the BR-21 rocket, modified 21-centimeter mortar tubes that fired timed projectiles from 1,000 meters into dense bomber streams. In heavy battles, JG-11 scored impressive numbers of bomber kills, but even these tactical victories could not change the strategic truth. The Americans could replace their losses. Germany could not. The greatest blow came not from combat, but from collapse within the Luftwaffe itself. Before the war, German pilot training had been among the finest in the world. Trainees logged over 250 flight hours, mastering aerobatics, formation flying, and live gunnery practice. By 1944, that system lay in ruins. Training time had fallen to barely 112 hours, often cut short by fuel shortages. Young pilots were being sent into battle half-prepared, facing veteran American and British airmen in machines they barely knew how to fly. The difference between German and American training was devastating. Pilots of the United States Army Air Forces received more than 300 flight hours before ever entering combat. They arrived at their units fully trained and ready for war. By contrast, German pilots in 1944 were being sent to the front barely able to handle their aircraft, let alone survive against experienced enemies. Johannes Steinhoff, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful aces, with 176 victories, later described the grim reality in his memoirs. "We received young men, boys really, who had perhaps 100 hours total flying time, maybe 10 hours on the Bf-109. We were expected to make them combat ready in 2 weeks. Most of them were dead within their first 5 missions. The statistics confirmed this tragic cycle. In the first 6 months of 1943 alone, the Luftwaffe lost more than 1,100 fighter pilots, 60% of its January strength. By 1944, monthly pilot attrition reached 25%. Fighter units were being wiped out and rebuilt every 4 months. By then, only the unit commanders carried any real combat experience. Most new pilots had between 8 and 30 days of active service before becoming casualties. Then came the Allied oil campaign, the death blow. Germany's synthetic fuel plants produced 124,000 barrels of oil per day in early 1944, supplying more than 90% of the Reich's aviation fuel. Starting in May 1944, these plants became prime targets for Allied bombers. On May 12, 1944, the Allies launched a massive strike. 935 bombers hammered Germany's synthetic oil plants. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. Fuel production collapsed. From 175,000 tons in April, it fell to 52,000 in June, 35,000 in July, and by September, barely 5,000 tons. By July, Albert Speer reported that 98% of Axis fuel plants were out of operation. The irony was cruel. German aircraft production in 1944 reached its highest level of the entire war. Nearly 40,000 aircraft, including almost 25,000 fighters. In September, monthly production peaked at more than 3,000 planes. But these machines had no fuel to fly and no trained pilots to fly them. On airfields across the Reich, ground crews used oxen to tow aircraft in order to conserve precious drops of gasoline. By November 1944, all training flights were suspended. Frontline combat units received only 10% of their minimum fuel requirements. Some pilots were restricted to just 1 training flight per month. By February 1945, synthetic fuel production had collapsed to less than 1% of its early 1944 level. The Luftwaffe was broken not only in body, but in spirit. The psychological destruction of Germany's fighter pilots came before their physical annihilation. Men who had entered the war as confident hunters became fatalistic survivors. Johannes Steinhoff captured the transformation in his memoir. In 1940, we were hunters. By 1943, we were the hunted. By 1944, we were simply targets. He wrote of watching despair spread through the squadrons, as pilots realized the war was already lost and that their leaders had abandoned all sense of responsibility. The crisis reached its peak on January 22, 1945. On that day, Germany's most decorated aces, Adolf Galland, Johannes Steinhoff, Günther Lützow, and Hannes Trautloft, confronted Hermann Göring in Berlin. Known as the Fighter Pilots' Revolt, this mutiny was unprecedented. The aces leveled charges of cowardice, condemned incompetent leadership, and protested the dismissal of Galland as general of fighters. It was the final proof of collapse, the complete breakdown of trust between Germany's frontline pilots and the very leadership that had sent them to die, Johannes. Steinhoff confronted Göring face to face. He demanded that the Me-262 jet fighters be released immediately for combat against the American bombers. The jets could still turn the tide, he argued. Göring's response revealed how far removed from reality he had become. He accused the pilots of treason, threatened them with execution, and even denied reality itself. When shown wreckage of P-51 Mustangs shot down over Germany, Göring declared it was impossible, claiming the aircraft must have glided in from outside German airspace. Instead of executing the mutinous aces, Göring dispersed them. Günther Lützow was banished to Italy, Steinhoff forbidden from entering Luftwaffe airfields, Trautloff stripped of his position. It was a symbolic act, the last remaining voices of reason silenced. Then came Operation Argument, Big Week. From February 20th to 25th, 1944, the Allies unleashed devastation. Over 3,000 sorties by the US 8th Air Force, 500 more from the 15th, and relentless night raids by the RAF dropped 10,000 tons of bombs on Germany's aircraft factories. On February 20th alone, more than 1,000 American bombers, shielded by 835 escort fighters, swept across German skies. The Luftwaffe managed to scramble barely 150 aircraft. Staffelkapitän Heinz Knoke of 5JG-11 recalled the grim truth. We took off with 8 aircraft. 2 aborted with engine trouble. Of the 6 that engaged, only 2 returned. The sky was full of Mustangs. By the end of the week, the Luftwaffe had lost 262 fighters and about 100 irreplaceable veteran pilots, including Hauptmann Kurt Uben, Knight's Cross holder with 110 victories. The Americans lost 226 bombers and 28 fighters, but their factories replaced these within days. The skies of Germany now belonged to the Allies. Then came the final psychological breaking point. On March 6, 1944, 730 B-17s and B-24s bombed Berlin itself in broad daylight, escorted by 800 fighters, many of them P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe mounted only 83 sorties. The result was inevitable. Heavy German losses for almost no effect. For the pilots, the sight was devastating. Their capital, burning under daylight bombardment while they were powerless to intervene. Adolf Galland later wrote, "March 6, 1944 was when I knew the war was lost. Not because Berlin was bombed, it had been bombed before, but because it was bombed in daylight. The Americans lost barely 5%, while we lost 30%. The memoirs of Germany's surviving aces tell the same story. Men who once ruled the skies, reduced to remnants, overwhelmed not by skill, but by the sheer weight of Allied industry and numbers. From supremacy to annihilation, this was the fate of the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. The true spirit of a fighter pilot is to attack, to hunt, to track, to destroy. That is where his skill, his courage, and his passion shine. Bind him to narrow orders, strip him of initiative, and you rob him of his greatest qualities, the aggressive spirit, the joy of action, the instinct of the hunter. Johannes Steinhoff, who flew nearly 1,000 combat missions, later wrote, "By the time these events unfolded, the leaders of the Reich had abandoned every standard of responsible action toward their own people and toward the enemy. We fighter pilots were caught in the middle of this madness. The change in spirit was written even in the diaries of the men themselves." Heinz Knoke, early in the war, confessed, "The prospect of actually experiencing war rather appeals to me." But by 1944 his words carried only despair, an admission of the hopelessness of their position, of fighting on against overwhelming numbers for no purpose at all. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's most lethal aces with 221 victories, described the progression bluntly. "In 1940 we owned the sky. In 1941 we shared it with the RAF. By 1943 we were disputing it with the Americans. By 1944 we were merely trying to survive in it. There was still one last hope, the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, capable of 540 miles per hour, more than 100 faster than any Allied aircraft. It should have changed everything. Over 2,400 were built. But Hitler squandered the miracle. Obsessed with using the jet as a bomber, he delayed its fighter deployment until late 1944. When Adolf Galland first flew the Me-262, he said it felt as though angels were pushing. Hitler's only question, how many bombs can it carry? By the time the Me-262 finally entered combat, it was too late. Fuel shortages crippled training. Jagdgeschwader 7, the world's first jet wing, could rarely put more than 30 aircraft into the sky at once. Against 1,000-plane Allied raids, even revolutionary technology was meaningless. And then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. The greatest invasion in history. Years of preparation had left Luftwaffe 3 with only 100 operational fighters. Against them, the Allies launched nearly 12,000 sorties. The Luftwaffe flew only 319 missions that day, barely 35 of them fighters. The most famous attack of the day was pure futility. Josef Priller and his wingman Heinz Knoke, just 2 fighters, were ordered to strike the beaches of Normandy. Priller later remembered, attack the invasion with 2 fighters. It was insane. They made a single strafing pass over Sword Beach, then fled. That was the daylight response of the once mighty Luftwaffe to the largest amphibious assault the world had ever seen. By 1944, the Luftwaffe's losses had become catastrophic. A total of 26,800 fighter pilots were killed or went missing during the war. Month by month, the numbers painted a picture of collapse. January 1944, 16.9%. Lost. February, 18.2% lost. March, 21.7%. Lost April, 19.8% lost. May, 24.3%. Solid June, 25.8% lost. At these rates, entire units disappeared every 4 months. Fresh graduates from the flight schools went straight into death. The December 1943 class of Jagdfliegerschule 5, barely trained, suffered 80% casualties within just 3 months. The attrition was merciless. Between January and June 1944, JG-26 lost 58 pilots killed. No amount of courage could overcome the disparity. The destruction of the Luftwaffe remains one of history's most enduring lessons about industrial warfare. Germany's fighter pilots, once the best trained and most experienced in the world, were not defeated because they lacked bravery, but because the mathematics of war had turned against them. The American approach, mass production, adequate training for many, and the ability to sustain losses proved superior to German reliance on individual brilliance. While German aces amassed spectacular victory counts, those numbers could not alter an outcome determined by factories, fuel, and logistics. For the men in the cockpits, the truth was inescapable. When German pilots climbed into the sky to face vast bomber streams with only a handful of fighters, they saw the reality of industrial warfare with their own eyes. Veteran pilots remembered looking up to see skies filled with silver bombers stretching from horizon to horizon, a metallic tide that heralded not only Germany's defeat, but the end of an era. The transformation came with brutal speed. In 1940, German fighters had swept the skies clean, masters of Europe's airspace. By 1944, they could barely defend their own airfields. This was not gradual decline, it was catastrophic collapse. The fighter pilots' revolt of January 1945 marked the final acknowledgement of this truth. When Germany's most decorated aces told Göring to his face that the war was lost, they were not only rebelling against leadership, they were admitting what every pilot already knew. German fighter pilots learned modern warfare's harshest lesson: individual excellence, no matter how extraordinary, cannot overcome systemic superiority. They flew on knowing they were already defeated, knowing their sacrifices would not change the outcome. Some out of duty, some out of habit, some because they knew no other life. Their testimony is more than just the story of defeat. It is the story of transformation. They had fought not just the Allies, but the mathematics of modern war. And they learned in blood that when the skies are filled with enough metal, individual warriors no longer matter. The age of the ace was over. The age of mass production had begun. JG-2 Richthofen lost 67 points, JG-11 lost 73. When Josef Priller took command of JG-26 in early 1943, he had 23 seasoned pilots with more than 100 missions each. By June 1944, only 3 remained. Part of the tragedy was Germany's catastrophic miscalculation of American strength. In 1942, German intelligence estimated the US would produce 18,000 aircraft. The real number was 47,836. For 1943, they guessed 30,000. The reality, 85,898. By 1944, they estimated 50,000. America actually produced 96,318. When Göring was handed reports that US fighter production had reached 3,000 per month, he burned them, dismissing them as enemy propaganda. The truth was even worse. America was building over 3,600 fighters every month. The numbers told a story no pilot could escape. The B-17 Flying Fortress alone saw 12,531 built. Boeing's Seattle plant rolled out 16 a day. Ford's Willow Run produced a B-24 every 63 minutes. Meanwhile, despite Speer's desperate reforms, Germany's peak production in 1944, 39,807 aircraft, meant nothing. There was no fuel, no pilots, no time left. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe existed only on paper. Of the 1,000 fighters supposedly available, perhaps 100 could take off on any given day. Fuel shortages allowed each pilot just one sortie per week. Most had fewer than 50 hours total flight time. On March 18, 1945, Heinz Knoke flew his last mission. His diary entry was bleak: worn-out aircraft, exhausted pilots, empty fuel tanks, and the certainty of defeat. The mathematics that had been evident since 1943 had now reached their inevitable conclusion. The Luftwaffe lost 76,875 aircraft in the war, including 43,000 in combat. Human losses were staggering: 165,000 killed, 155,000 wounded, 192,000 missing or captured. By comparison, the U.S. 8th Air Force, out of more than 350,000 men, lost 26,000 killed. Grievous but sustainable. America could replace its losses. Germany could not. In 1944 alone, the Allies produced 163,099 aircraft. Germany managed just 39,807. The numbers were not just statistics, they were a death sentence.